Oh, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another of our Dare Dallas webinars. And the sharp-eyed among you might have noticed we've swapped places. So as interviewee, I've become interviewer, which is a first for me and very exciting. And even more exciting is that I get to speak to my good friend and colleague here at Dare Dallas, Alastair MEIKLEJON, who's going to talk to us today about guitars, something which probably all of us in our youth have attempted to do, either play or own a guitar. And so maybe, Alastair, kick us off. How did it all start?
Oh gosh, well, first of all, lovely to see you, Jonathan. As I say, it's a bit strange being on the other side for once, but always a pleasure to speak to you. Well, in terms of guitars and music, for me, it all really started. I think, like everyone else, as you quite rightly put, everyone thinks they're going to be a musician at some point in their lives, and I went through that phase for a slightly longer period than most, I would assume, and I was surrounded by music and somehow got my way through university by paying my way by being a sound engineer. So I used to go and basically do live sound for bands at student unions, and then worked up to bigger venues, and then eventually kind of started doing sound for bands properly, and yeah. Things like that. That's kind of how I got into it, and obviously had a love for music and a love for musical instruments. And I think the great thing about musical instruments and other items such as that, I quite like microphones as well, but I won't go into too much detail. That's really
separate webinar on microphones.
I think most people would switch off after about 5
minutes. Yes, 5 minutes. Yes.
Frequency range responses is not fun. But I think guitars are one of those great things that they're instantly appealing. There's something about them. There's a great history behind them, and obviously they're all slightly different as well. So you've got different designs, you've got sounds, you've got everything really, and that's what I love about it. And it also, I think, with any band, for me, I look at a band, and if I look at a guitarist, I think of the guitar that he would have played. And I kind of visualize that in many ways. So it's a really important part, certainly of my youth and part of my interests. And I've got a few guitars and bits and bobs and things like that still kicking about, which is always nice to have. And another reason that we're doing it on this webinar is that they are a great investment, and things, and I'll come on to some things in a little while, but I remember, I think back in about 1998, I bought a 1974 Telecaster, a Fender Telecaster. And I think at the time I paid about 500 quid for it. It seemed like a lot of money at the time when you're a relatively poor student. Now that's worth about 5 grand or somewhere around those kind of figures. So you can tell the way in which kind of things have gone, and the way in which vintage guitars certainly have escalated in value. It has just been absolutely tremendous. But we'll go through a bit of those as we go on.
And we're talking here about electric guitars, is that right? Why electric as opposed to acoustic, or is there a reason for that?
I mean, the thing with electric guitars came about because there needed to be an electric guitar. I originally started with all these jazz guys who were playing quite large-bodied jazz guitars, which were predominantly acoustic. So at first they're almost like a violin with F-holes in, and they were made by a luthier, and they were made to resonate. And obviously they resonated to a certain point, but you couldn't keep up with, some guy on a drum kit and a double bass, because they just didn't compete. So the first electrics really that came about were large-bodied jazz guitars. So, for example, Gibson, who we'll talk about a little bit later, Gibson were a great musical instrument company who were making acoustic guitars kind of in the early part of last century. And they basically just put a pickup. I think it was their Gibson L150 model, which I haven't, unfortunately, but that was the thing that they did. So they kind of electrified acoustic instruments, if you see what I mean. So it wasn't a case of really making an electric guitar. It was more of a means to an end in order to get this guitar volume higher.
Yeah. So so in other words, they just wanted to be heard in a crowded club, and it just wasn't going to cut it if you're quietly plucking away at a regular guitar. I see.
Well, this was it. But strangely, when the first kind of real kind of normal kind of electric guitars that you may think that you recognize now came about, it wasn't actually for jazz. It was more for slide guitar. I'm just going to bring up an image here. Now, this is, again, everything I say on this webinar will strangely be debated by everyone on every single forum that's ever been, because guitars is such a really interesting thing that everyone will say, oh, they did it first, or they did it here, or they did it there, and they did it there. So it's a really bizarre thing. So everything I'm saying is with the best of knowledge, but I do take a slight caveat in that somebody will disagree with me. But this looks
very weird. This looks a very weird one to me.
So this is the frying pan, and this was made by a chap called Rickenbacker, spelled with an H, and we'll come back to him later. Yeah. One of my favourite guitar manufacturers. But this was pretty much made as a Hawaiian lap steel guitar. So you tune it to an open G or an open E, and you'd literally just play a metal bar and stroke that across the top, and you'd have that really nice kind of Hawaiian sound that obviously later was used in kind of Delta blues and things like that. So you've got that really nice kind of dirty sound, and it's, again, so simple, it's unreal. It's a horseshoe pickup. You look down at the bridge there, and
I see.
Very
the metal
simple
piece there. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's that, and then you've got the bridge at the back, and then you've got one volume control, and that's all you need, really. And that's,
you play it flat or
yeah, you play it flat. So you could either play this, you could get it with a table that was supplied to you. So it basically, much like a Fender Rhodes table with 4 chrome legs, you pop that on the top and then you play it like this. Or as many people do, it's a little bit kind of difficult to work out the scale, but it's not a particularly big thing. It's only about 2.5 foot long. So
yeah.
It's again, that was in my opinion the first real kind of steps towards where an electric guitar would be. But this was kind of in the mid-30s, so this was still a way off what we consider to be the electric guitar, if you will. But we'll come to that now. This possibly is one of the most groundbreaking items that we'll look at today. So let's just bring this one up. So this is beginning to get a little bit more like what we would consider to be an electric guitar. So this is a really, really early incarnation of Leo Fender. Leo Fender was a chap that was working out of California, and he was trying to develop a guitar that obviously could be amplified, would make a decent sound, would stay in tune, and do everything that basically musicians wanted, but from a guitar that you could plug in as opposed to one that you could just strum. So this was the first incarnation of the Telecaster, but at this point, it was known as the Fender Broadcaster. The Fender Broadcaster, we'll come back to that a little bit later, but the Fender Broadcaster had some problems with trademark issues over their name, because there was another company called Gretsch that actually had a drum kit called the Broadcaster. So Leo Fender had to agree to get rid of it. So this was around about 1951 that this came out. So there were 2 models that were brought out. This was the prototype model. If this was a production model, it'd be known as the Esquire, because it's got a single bridge pickup there. And then a maple neck, and usually just a solid older body or something along those lines. But around this period, they were using pretty much anything they could. But the big problem that Leo Fender had, and one that actually pretty much, again, there are loads of points where I'm going to say change the world, but this did change the world. With the neck of the guitar, so the board with the frets on, the problem that you had was that with an electric guitar, the tension was so high that it would actually cause the wood to bend. Now, he tried many ways of actually getting around this before he came up with the idea of a truss rod. So a truss rod is a piece of metal that goes down the length of the fingerboard, just underneath the fingerboard on the neck. And what you can do, you can actually take the top of it and actually adjust that with a wrench. So if you feel that the neck is warping slightly, you can actually adjust it and it will bring the guitar back in. Another fantastic innovation you've got there, 3 saddle bridge. It's brilliantly simple. So you can adjust intonation to a certain point, but unfortunately 2 of those strings will always be out. And I've had Telecasters that have been absolutely terrible, and you can never get the G and the D in tune. But that's the sound. Again, we'll talk about this a lot. The sound of that guitar is because that's the way it's made. But you also see where on an acoustic guitar, for example, the strings go up through the back, through the bridge, and then onto the fingerboard. In a Telecaster, what Leo Fender actually did was he drilled holes right through the body. So what you would do is you would actually string the actual strings through the back, and so they would hold up tight against the actual wood. So you get the resonance of the wood. And this is where the resonance thing kind of really comes into it. So that is pretty much the first incarnation of what I would call the first proper electric guitar.
So this is the genesis of everything that follows on.
I think so. I mean, want, again, as I say, somebody will completely disagree with me on a lot of these facts, but I think it's just opinion. But with this, again, but it was such a brilliantly easy guitar to make as well. It's a bolt-on neck, which you can't see. So on the back of it, you've actually got literally a metal plaque that attaches to the body and to the neck, which means if you ever broke the neck, you could just replace it. If you need to adjust the neck, you can adjust it. It makes life so much simpler for people who want a workaday guitar. And these things, pretty much unchanged, are exactly the same as they are now. But
who would have bought them at this time? Was it musicians simply playing for themselves? They're all bought at the time by performance musicians, band members, and so on.
I think so. I mean, the jazz guys, I mean, you could, ironically, in that guitar, there was what was known as a dark circuit. So you could get this kind of muffledy kind of jazz tone out of it. And that worked quite well. A lot of them were from guys in show bands that were obviously doing big gigs. And at this point, rock and roll hadn't really kind of taken off. We were still in kind of big band kind of era music. And I think with that was kind of where Leo Fender was almost appealing to guys. There was nothing stylistic about it. It was all function. And the function of it was to make that instrument louder. And the fact that there were, different pickups in it because they made a slightly different sound, it was almost irrelevant at this point. It was just to make it louder. So that was the Telecaster then. And we'll just bring this up because this gives you a good example of what the final model was like. So this is a Fender Broadcaster. Now, as I was saying, the Fender Broadcaster, unfortunately, they had to drop the name because of the copyright infringement. But you can see the basis, obviously, of the original guitar around this. The only difference being is you've got a full width black Bakelite scratch guard on there. You've obviously got the pickup selector down there on the control panel, so you can switch between two. If you look at the bridge section, you can actually see that's what's colloquially known as the ashtray, because I think in the 1950s, about 90% of people took that off and used it as an ashtray rather than actually have it pickup cover.
Oh, I see. Yes, it covers what was open on the last one you showed us.
Yeah, pickup covers are strange. You'll see them around this period in guitars from Rickenbacker and Gibson and everyone, really. But they were quite weird. They had them on there. But again, you could rest the back of your palm on them if you were strumming, so they're actually quite useful. But this again, it's a beautiful guitar. I think it looks like its original thermometer case, which was made from tweed, the same tweed that Fender amps were made from at the time. And stuff. But how many of these were made? Again, we'll talk about the debates of these, but maybe about 400, 500, something like that. If you find one now, I know there's a few people. I think Tom Petty had one. Bruce Springsteen still has one. He's really well known for having a Broadcaster. They're six-figure guitars. Just really, really collectible pieces. I mean, it's literally as early as you can get. In terms of broadcasters and electric guitars, in my opinion. So that's a belter and a really, really good example.
Is the value affected by who owned or played a guitar like that? Oh,
absolutely. I think I did. I'm not sure if anyone caught our quiz. Oh, it might have actually been last Christmas, where I was talking about Dave Gilmour's Strat. That basically was a Fender Strat, and there were a few bits of original Fender Strat in there. However, it had all been changed at some point and all completely messed about with. However, the fact that it had been owned by Dave Gilmour meant that it was absolutely astronomical. I think there are two very, very different schools of thought with guitars, more than it is, I suppose, possibly with paintings or possibly with cars, where people want that celebrity ownership. Yeah. I think the people that buy celebrity-owned guitars are buying them to stick them on a wall and put them in a case and go, look who owned this, and here's a picture of them at the Montreux Jazz Festival in 1958 or something like that, and say, isn't this great? Whereas the people that spend decent money on guitars that are decent guitars are going to buy them to play, because ultimately that's why you buy them. Musical instruments should be about playing.
Yes. Interesting. Yes, I remember reading about the Paul Newman wristwatch. That was, and obviously the value there. it was a Paul Newman Daytona. So I guess you just buy that. You're not going to play it, are you? But guitars, I just wonder.
It's a good comparison. I mean, the thing is, for example, Paul Newman was really, really well known for wearing that Daytona. And he was really, really well known as, you know, an aficionado of Rolex watches. And I think that has a really good kind of basis for it. I suppose one could be the same if you got something like, you know, Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin's Les Paul, which he's really well known for playing. He's got a 59 Les Paul. He was one of the first people to start playing 59 Les Pauls, for example. And I mean, that is just iconic to the whole band's image. You see a picture of Jimmy Page on stage in the late 60s. He's got a ridiculous floral suit on and generally a sunburst 59 Les Paul. That it's their trademark and their trademark sound. Although strangely, that first album was all done on a Telecaster, but they don't tell many people that. But it's funny. Speaking about Les Pauls, again, maybe the most important guitar of all time, maybe the second most important guitar of all time. That would be another debate for the forums. But I'll bring up just a really good example here, and I found this image. And this is a really good example of how Les Pauls evolved over the years. So Les Paul was a musician, and he then kind of got quite pally with Ted McCarthy, who was running Gibson at the time. And Gibson guitars were making really, really incredibly good quality acoustics, JT100s, J185s, J50s, things like that, workerman guitars, good jazz guitars as well, and other things. And at this point, they knew they had to kind of venture out, because Fender were at this point where they were saying, okay, we're making really, really good solid body guitars now, and people are buying them. And Les Paul, again, who was a fantastic innovator, I think he came up with one of the first ideas for 4-track machines. He came up with ideas for electronics and guitars. Actually, far more influential, probably, to the music world unfortunately, than his music was. So Les Paul was he American, or is he American, or British? He was American. He was a musician. Very, very, I hate to say it, but probably more well known for the Les Paul than he was for any of his records.
Yes, I've only heard of the guitar. I don't know much about him.
Yeah, I don't think many people have, and I think a lot of people are actually quite surprised when they realise that it's actually a chap. So the one far left is a 1952, and that's a gold top. It was painted with old gold paint, and that's the only one you could get at that point in time. The only colour they did, and so you'll see it's a little bit different to what you would expect to see a normal Les Paul to be. So at the bottom end there, we've got a trapeze tailpiece, which basically puts the tension back on, you know, the bottom part of the guitar again. And there's
I see. That's that metal bit at the bottom.
Yeah, that's the trapeze there. And then it's a bit of a bizarre bridge arrangement there, which is called a wraparound bridge. So the actual strings go in the front and round the back and then come out the top again. So it's a little bit weird. And you've also got a bridge there, but the bridge isn't compensated like you see later on, which we'll go on to. So again, the intonation is a bit of a problem again. So much like the Telecaster that we were looking at in the previous photo, they've never been perfect on pitch. However, that's their sound, and that's what people like. The pickups in there are cream top P90s, which are single coil pickups. And again, very, very standard of the time. What they were trying to do was literally make things louder. And that was effectively what they were doing. You can see a slight difference with the body shape, whereby you can see quite a lot of chamfering around the edges. Which was, you can see it more on the gold top, because obviously the way the paint lies, you can see the shine on it, and it does continue in later models as well, but it was always a little bit more apparent in that model. So that was kind of the start of the Les Paul journey. Now they did this, that model, up until about 1956, back end of 56, 57, where they brought in the Les Paul Standard, which is the one in the middle. Now, the Les Paul Standard from 57 to 60/61, depending on who you talk to, is probably the most iconic guitar of its period. It is commonly noted that there are probably 5 times the amount on the market that were ever made during that period, because they're what everyone wants. The 59 Les completely iconic. The irony was, through this time from about 57 to about 1960, Gibson weren't selling any Les Pauls. Nobody was buying them. They were considered to be so out of date. Nobody wanted to play them. They were very heavy. I mean, ridiculously heavy, kind of 6-8 guitars, and nobody wanted them. And so around about 1960, they decided that they were going to discontinue the current Les Paul model. So what they did was they didn't actually tell Les Paul, but they completely reshaped the entire body. And what you see on the right is the 1962 Les Paul Standard. However, most people will know that as an SG. But what happened was Les Paul basically didn't know about this, and he was still happily playing his probably his very early Les Paul. And he basically found out that they changed it and went absolutely berserk because he hated the guitar, he hated the look of it, and hated everything about it. So they went, oh gosh, okay. And by this point, they discontinued that Les Paul because because it was so unpopular. So they were pushing the SG, or the Les Paul, the new Les Paul. And yeah, so they basically said, okay, fine, we'll take your name off it, but we'll continue to sell it. So they renamed it the SG, which stands for Solid Guitar, which I thought was possibly the most uninventive name in the history of guitars. But it's a really good example of that model. But the rest, as they say with these models, is history. You look at things nowadays, and that 59 Les Paul, for example, nowadays, the right one is close to $500,000, that kind of figure. And from that period, 57 to 1960 is the period where they were they weren't selling. They all thought they were very old-fashioned. They were too heavy, and nobody wanted them. But then, as soon as people started picking up on the fact that, hang on a second, these guitars were just brilliantly made, people started buying them and started spending money on them. I think Jimmy Page was one of the first people to actually have a 59 Les Paul. And Paul Kossoff from Free, I think, had a 59 Les Paul. So there's lots of them that exist, but they're almost mythical now in status, because I think so many of them have been hidden away, and people just want to kind of mother them.
Well, in the tradition of the Antiques Roadshow attic find, do they appear in attics? I guess logically, if you are a family and you've got a guitar, you might pop it up there. Does that ever happen, that guitars appear as attic finds? Or
it more happens, I would say, with Fenders than it does with Gibsons, because Gibsons have always been pretty expensive guitars. If you were going to be a professional, and this is a bit of a funny kind of statement, but I suppose if you were going to be a professional and buy a Gibson, you would know its intrinsic value in your. I mean, it's not to say it doesn't happen, but I think the guitar that really kind of changed the face, and the most probably iconic guitar, and the guitar that you probably see most of, because they sold the most of them, and they were, the most forward-thinking guitar of its time. I'll bring it up, and this is a really, really, really nice. Let's see if we've got it. There we go. So this is a 1954 Strat. So this, I mean, just you couldn't get any better than that, really, to be honest. If you look at the great way to tell how good a guitar is, if you look at the fingerboard and see how completely knackered it is, and if it's that knackered, you know it's got to be pretty good.
Oh, I see. Yes, it's sort of worn. It's got its own. So it's like a worn Georgian desk, isn't it? It's sort of worn away in a good way from use.
Yeah, exactly that. And people will tell you that the amount of sweat and skin cells and everything else that poured into that actually makes it sound infinitely better. I'm sure it's probably been refretted in that time, because you couldn't play it with that amount of wear without having the frets redone. But that's kind of by the by. But the Strat, this was Leo Fender's second creation. This came out in 1954, and probably of all the electric guitars in the world, probably the one that most people recognize. It's the one that Buddy Holly played. It's, it was there at the forefront of, guitars and rock and roll.
It looks to me ahead of its time. If you'd have said to me, Jonathan, I'm not going to tell you anything about this, date it for me, I would have put it in the 60s rather than 50s. It's a very futuristic design.
I mean, I think Leo Fender at the time, he said he was always looking at cars, and he always loved the way that when you looked at a car, if you looked at the right car, it looked as if it was moving. And I think you had exactly the same thing with the Stratocaster. I mean, again, this was 1954, so when everything in Britain was very grey and drab, but I think everything in California in the mid 1950s, I imagine, was kind of bright and colourful with Charles and Ray Eames and kind of Pacific Palisades period colours and things like this. So this is a really good example. But just to go back to the guitar, you can see how simple it is. That's a 2-colour sunburst. I think that's a nitro cellulose finish on it. So it'll actually be really, really not massively hard wearing, but it's been kept in such brilliant condition. And that was really the first kind of entity of the Stratocaster. Strangely, it's funny you should mention about design of guitars, because again, it's so important. But around just after this period, 2 of my favorite guitars, well, I think one was, the one on the left is the Fender Jazzmaster. That was released in 1958. And the one on the right is the Fender Jaguar. And that I think is in shoreline gold, which is beautiful, beautiful metallic color. Yeah. But that was released in 62, so 58 and 62. Now, they were, again, way, way, way ahead of their time, and ridiculously complicated. You can see the amount of switches on them and things like that. And if you look by the bridge, there's what's known as a mute on the Jaguar. Just, again, ridiculously complicated guitars, but so far ahead of their time in terms of design. And these were kind of, I mean, if you see Brian Wilson or Carl Wilson from the Beach Boys, they always had a Jaguar or a Jazzmaster, and they were, you know, really, really popular guitars. But these guitars, again, just, it's funny because you look at some guitars, and these were brilliantly popular in the early 60s to the mid 60s, completely fell out of love with everyone. And then possibly in the mid 80s to the late 80s and the early 90s, kind of got involved in kind of the indie music and the grunge revival kind of thing. And everyone was using them then because they were cheap and available. And the fact that they were cheap and available made the guitar so indicative of that time and definitive of the sound that the guitars were actually going through. So that was that. I you know, I'm a big fan of those, and that, you know, really, really, really interesting guitars, and not just the run-of-the-mill thing. And you could get them in great colors as well.
And the shape, to my eyes, is very distinctive. Is that a signature shape for the Fender, that particular make? So it remains that shape.
Yeah, I mean, again, offset guitars, as they were known, it's that offset waist. Again, it was that vision of looking forward, if you see what I mean. It was that vision of making something that looked as if it was moving and future. And they were all about that. And Fender were very, very, very much so like that. Gibson, I think, were a little bit more traditional in their efforts, although they did later do some absolutely outlandish guitars. In fact, I should have brought some of these up. There was the Flying V, which I think is quite a well-known guitar. That was literally a big slab of mahogany, the shape of the V, and the Explorer, which basically looked like some kind of medieval battle axe, which was quite interesting. But generally speaking, in terms of creating futuristic, very things of that period, Fender were pretty much ahead of their time, and putting out lots and lots of interesting kind of pieces around that point as well.
Where could you go and see guitars? I mean, we talk about art, and you go to a museum. You talk about many of the things we discuss on these webinars. Is there a place you might go to, or is there no museum of guitars?
Oh, there's a few museums of guitars. Ironically, the best guitar museum I've ever been to was near the Alhambra in Spain, of all places. And I remember going there with my wife one day and seeing a guitar museum. I thought, we'll pop and have a look at that. And it was tremendous. It was absolutely amazing, and had some really, really good examples. But the funny thing is, and what we'll go on to later is, well, we'll talk about it now. In the 1950s, end of the 1950s, if you look at the electric guitars that sold and the models that had sold, and you look at the top 10, in that top 10 will always be a Les Paul, a Telecaster, a Stratocaster, probably a Jag, probably a 335. We'll talk about a 335 later. There will always be the same models of guitars. If you look at the 60s, there will probably be the same models of guitars. If you look at the 70s, it will probably be the same models of guitars. And that just seemed to be the way it went. Unfortunately, until the 80s, when people got guitars like this, and that kind of ruined everything for a little while. And then we went back to the 90s where guitars were popular again and people were playing them. So they've always been the same thing. So if you just go to a music shop, you will see pretty much the same designs. These things get kind of moved about every now and again. There's a slightly different design of it, but effectively, if you go and buy a American standard Telecaster today, you will get pretty much the same thing that you would have got in the early 1950s, with slight different things, maybe slightly different woods because of the way that woods have changed, but pretty much in essence, you will have exactly the same guitar.
So I guess it's a successful model, isn't it, really, that is perhaps like a car updated and watches. Basically, the Rolex remains the same, but there's different versions of it and so on. Fascinating. They
got it right first time with so many of these guitars. I mean, there were certain things they got wrong, but ironically, the guitars that they actually got wrong were the guitars where they tried to change things or tried to modernize things and tried to do different things, which never really kind of made much sense to me. But they basically, when they did what they stuck to and did what they knew, then you can't go wrong.
And in terms of values of these, are they things which you look at, I don't know, interest in wristwatches and in cars over the last 10 years, that's increased manyfold. Is that happening with guitars, or is it a level market?
It goes up and down, and I think it's a lot different to cars, where generally at the moment they seem to be escalating at a rate of knots, and it's different to watches, which are exactly the same. With guitars, I think it's very much even more fashion driven, because it's all dependent on who's playing them. So when I think if you look at kind of guitars like Stratocasters at the moment, possibly not as popular as they were 10 years ago, and prices aren't what they were. But Les Paul, certainly, I mean, really good example here. That's a really, really nice, I would say 72, 73 Les Paul. It's got slightly different knobs, which are called witch hat knobs, which I think is why I think it's a 72 or 73. But really, really beautiful guitar. But back in the 90s, again, I could have bought one of them for £1,000. I mean, you can see, I mean, the thing I love about this guitar is you can see how much somebody's loved it, because all the screws are rusted around the pickups, where somebody's been sweating like mad playing it and really having a good show. So that's what a Les Paul should look like. And also that binding would have been white at one point. So obviously they've been in smoky clubs and sweating and everything that possibly you wouldn't want a fantastic piece of artwork. Is it right? It's the total opposite of where you'd want a piece of artwork to be. But ironically, with the guitar, I think it adds character.
Yeah, I think for a picture, it's in what I would call original condition, original untouched condition, which is it's very good to see.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's what I like about it. But back in the 90s, I could have bought one of them for £1,000, somewhere like that, possibly even 800 quid. Nowadays, a good 70s one is £4 or £5, somewhere around that. So what some would consider better condition would be a little bit more. But what you don't want is for it to be refinished or repainted or anything else like that. Exactly the same with watches. You don't want anything changed. Pickups have got to be exactly the same. I mean, if we were talking about that 59 Les Paul, just the pick guard, the bit underneath the pickups, on one of those, an original 1959 plastic pick guard for a Les Paul would cost you about £10,000–15,000 just for the bit of plastic.
Yeah.
But if you changed it out, then it would completely reduce the value of the guitar. So everything has to be completely original. That's so important.
Yes, I hadn't realised. Yes, and in terms of authenticity, is that something which is guaranteed? What would you look out for or advise people to be careful of?
I think the thing is with authenticity of the guitar, always have a good luthier look at it, because with Fenders, for example, you may have had necks being taken off, you may have had certain things changed. You'll get always guitars that are what's known as a player grade. So for example, it will make them a better guitar, but unfortunately, it will make them less valuable. So, for example, a 1960s Stratocaster. We'll just bring this up because this is a slightly different Stratocaster to the one we saw. This is very much like the Hendrix Strat. So this is a post-CBS. So in 1965, Leo Fender actually sold the Fender Musical Instruments Company to a firm called CBS, and CBS took over and basically changed the entire face of Fender. So they started to make things bigger and started to change things. Some would say not for the better. To be honest, I think it's just a way things went. But if you see the headstock is slightly bigger where the machine heads are and where the strings all terminate. Yeah. So they changed that, and but I mean, so if you look at the Stratocaster, the thing that somebody would have changed on the Strat is those machine heads to make it play better, because the ones that were made in the 60s weren't as good as the ones you can get now. And if you wanted your guitar to stay in tune, you'd probably change it. If you look at the bridge, that will have springs in it that probably will have been changed over the years. The thing that people get really irate about are the pickups and the pots. So, for example, the pickups in there, if somebody has changed any of the pickups out, it's a no-go. You just don't touch it.
Nice.
The pots and the pickup selector, ironically, apparently the pickup selector is just that little switch, and apparently the pickup selector in Dave Gilmour's Stratocaster was the only original part of the original guitar that he owned. So that sums up how much that was worth in the whole grand scheme of things. But those pots, they're capacitors and basically just kind of variable resistors. But people change them out to make it sound slightly different, or because they get worn out. But if they are original, it obviously makes a big deal to the value of the guitar.
We're talking here about guitars. Is there a pecking order of owners, if you like? Is there a top 10? In other words, is Eric Clapton #1 or Hendrix #1, or is there a different order for guitars?
So if you were going to buy a guitar that was owned by somebody,
yeah.
I think for a lot of people, I still think it would be the Buddy Holly Stratocaster. I think everyone would love to own that, just because it was that dawning age of guitars. There was the John Lennon, I suppose, no, because that was an acoustic guitar, but again, it had a pickup, so we'll kind of include it. There was the John Lennon's J160E, the E denoting that it was an electric guitar, which was I think that sold for about 1.2 million in the States, which was quite a good sell. But there are things that come about. Musicians, by their very nature, use lots of guitars. You know, Clapton has used so many guitars. I think Brownie, which was his rather non-interestingly named Brown Stratocaster, I think that would be worth a couple of mil now, something around that, just because of the songs that he recorded on. I think Layla was recorded on that, so therefore it's worth a ridiculous amount of money. And you know, there are loads of guitars out there that have been sold. But the funny thing is, a lot of them have been sold for charitable trusts and things like that. I remember George Harrison sold a few of his guitars before he died, and they didn't make a huge amount of money, ironically, which was rather sad. Me personally, I love Rickenbackers, and Rickenbackers, I've had 2 or 3 in my lifetime. I don't have one at the moment because I bought a Gretsch. But Rickenbackers have always been something that really interested me. So one of the biggest kind of people that had Rickenbackers in the late 70s and the 80s was Paul Weller. And so those were his Rickenbackers from that kind of period when he was in the Jam. And I think he had the white one when he was in the Style Council as well. But they were very kind of, I've just found the imagery of those guitars is very, very quintessentially kind of that style, if you see what I mean. So they're lovely things. But again, designed in the 1960s, Rickenbacker don't make anything but the guitars that they designed in the 50s and the 60s. That's it. They don't modernize them. They just make them exactly the same. They might have a new color every few years, but they're pretty much exactly the same as they were when they were made then.
So they're still making them?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Goodness. But the funny thing is, sorry.
So one of the things that's come out, I mean, this is fascinating. The whole thing is utterly absorbing, and I can sense your enthusiasm as well. And I think I'm learning as I go along. But the standout for me, something I hadn't realized, was the distinctive shapes of each one. The Rickenbacker and the Fender all have, for the collector or indeed the owner, there's something to look look for there, isn't there? That these rich actors have a clear, you know, as a picture specialist, essentially, I'm looking for style and color and technique, which, you know, screams off the canvas to me, this is by whoever it's by. I just hadn't realized that it was true of guitars. Do they retain these? Do they copy each other's shapes, or they can hold on to a shape like a copyright almost?
Oh gosh, that's opening a massive can of worms.
Yeah,
so,
sorry.
No.
Close it if you want. Yes.
Gibson. We'll go back to the Les Paul here, because I think potentially Gibson had one of the most iconic designs of guitars. I'll bring up another example of another Les Paul. This is a 54 custom. I won't go into too much detail about it because it's slightly different from the others. But if we go back to what we're talking about, so copies. So in the 1970s, there were Japanese companies such as Tokai, Greco, Ibanez, who all made Les Paul copies. And they were known as the lawsuit models, because Gibson tried to sue all of these people. And for the most part, was generally successful. So they all kind of went off the market. But generally speaking, you can go and buy 30, 40 different brands that will all make a Les Paul. They won't call it a Les Paul, but they will make a model that is similar to a Les Paul.
I see.
There's some fantastic legislation out there. There was a Finnish company that made a Les Paul and called it a Les Paul. And in Finland, apparently, the legal position on it is that nobody owns the word Les Paul, so they can use it. So they actually used it. But what Gibson did in the late 1970s, early 80s, was they actually had their own sub-brand called Epiphone. And Epiphone have made, since then, a cheaper brand of Les Pauls. So effectively what you're doing is you're buying an officially licensed Les Paul, but buying it from a cheaper company, if you see what I mean. But they're looked over and owned by Gibson. So it's almost like a secondary brand, almost.
Yeah, so it's like a Skoda versus a VW sort of thing.
Pretty much, although they look the same. They probably drive the same.
Yes, they're just slightly thinner metal and whatever. It's different. Yeah, interesting. I was hoping that somehow I discovered something which would help me to identify them, but it sounds like there is, just as you say, a can of worms. So you think you're looking at a Les Paul, and it's a Japanese version of a Les Paul, or a Finnish version of a Les Paul.
Just to make things slightly more.
Oh, gosh. Oh well, I thought I discovered it.
there's a new wave at the moment of things called Gibsons, which are basically Gibsons made in China, which have got they look exactly the same. You wouldn't know until you picked one up and tried to play it that actually they're quite poor imitations. But if you look at it, it says Gibson on the headstock. It's got everything right. You get all the paperwork. It's much like copy watches, for example. You can get them, and they're remarkably good quality. So that's another kind of chink in the armor.
Yes, let's not go there.
but they are, again, but they've been phenomenal in the way that they've actually managed to manufacture them. Let me just bring something up. What was I going to bring up? This was one guitar that I wanted to mention that was probably one of the first reasons that I got into guitars. This is the Gibson BS355. So this is a variation of a 335, which is probably one of the most versatile guitars you can buy. But this guitar, I think, the big cherry red semi-acoustic, was one of the guitars really that got me kind of into music. I mean, obviously you've got the Chuck Berry kind of thing where people will look at that and go, okay, that's very known for Chuck Berry. You've also got Johnny Marr from the Smiths, who played one of these along with a Rickenbacker quite a lot, and a Telecaster. But I think in a lot of the videos you use this because it's a really, really good looking guitar. But, and Noel Gallagher used one actually, probably because Johnny Marr used one. But probably one of the things that made me think about guitars more than anything else was the Back to the Future film. And if you recall, in one of the scenes in Back to the Future and in Back to the Future 2, he's using not this exact guitar, because I think the one he uses in Back to the Future is a 345, which is slightly different because it's got slightly different inlays on the neck. But this type of thing was the thing that made me look at guitars and think, gosh, doesn't that look amazing? I didn't really care about music or anything at the time, but I thought, won't I look incredibly cool owning that? And I think that's what a lot of guitars is about. And I think a lot of people do own guitars that can't play them because they look great. And I think they are brilliant pieces of artwork.
Yeah, I agree. That to me looks very elegant. It's an almost a design icon in simplicity and those marks left and right. They look like violin.
Yeah, the F holes. Yeah.
The F holes, are they drawn on, or are they carved into the?
No, they're carved in. The 355 was a brilliant invention, because effectively it's a hollow body guitar, but it's quite a thin body. And what they did, they actually put a big block of wood that runs down the center of it. So you've got the torsional rigidity of a solid body guitar, but you've also got effectively these ears on the side that act as giving it the warmth of having an acoustic guitar. So very, very, very clever things. I mean, remarkably so. And this is, again, 1958 guitar, something like that. And, you know, just beautifully, beautifully engineered.
Yeah, I mean, forgive me if I think that's the first one like that we've seen, isn't it, in your slides?
We kind of focus on the more solid bodies, which, to be honest, is slightly more revolutionary. This one isn't quite as revolutionary, but it's, to my mind, still one of the prettiest guitars that you can find.
So in terms of people who are out there who, like me now, are enthused about this whole idea, is the revelation to me. Where is the best place to start? I mean, maybe if people say to me, you know, when they're buying pictures, maybe for the first 6 months, don't buy anything, just go looking. Yeah. And so, is there anywhere in the UK where you might go and see guitars?
I mean, at the moment, unfortunately, because of the COVID kind of situation, there aren't as many trade shows on, and even but guitar shows and things like that do exist, believe it or not.
Okay.
People go and huddle around. It's not my kind of idea of fun, really, because you get kind of 30 or 40 musos all playing like and it's not really an ideal place to kind of visit. But
like a costume convention, as it were, a Star Trek convention, it's a bit too much.
It's a bit too much. I mean, personally, I would always buy a guitar that says something to you, probably the same way as a painting.
Yeah.
You look at the guitar, you sit down and you can't stop playing it. That's the right guitar for you, and it always has been. And I bought some absolute duds in the past because I thought, okay, this is what I really should have. Oh gosh, I was trying to think. I didn't buy a Flying V. I almost bought a Flying V, but no, that was the kind of guitar I thought, oh great, I'll go and buy this. That'd be a great investment. And you tried playing it and it was horrid. I'm sure it was right for the right person, but it just wasn't right for me. And that's what guitars should always be about, because ultimately, as much as they're style icons and as much as they look brilliant and everything else like that, they need to be about the person that plays them. You can't, you know, I'm sure many musicians, we talk about Johnny Marr, I bet you could have, you know, written a fantastic, you know, tune on an old school kind of Spanish guitar or something like that. So it's you know, it's just an extension of yourself, a guitar, really, and that's what it always should be.
It sounds to me, I mean, I did try to learn to play it when I think I was sort of 12 or 13, and somehow, thinking back, it didn't work out. So I'm not a guitar player, but I understand that I can appreciate the beauty of these. It sounds like you don't have to be able to play them to enjoy them. Is that true?
I think so. I mean, I love, I mean, the historical factor of, I mean, I've got a 58 Melody Maker, which is basically a Les Paul Jr., which is one of the, you know, one of the earliest models of that. And when I bought that, I loved it. I tried playing it, and to be perfectly honest, it was so difficult to play because it's just really, 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 really old-fashioned. And the noise you get out of it is quite fun, but it's not useful at all. But I love the fact that I own it, and I think that's it's like stamp collecting to a certain degree. You never look at them, but you like knowing that you own it. And you know, it'll sit in a case, and I'll get it out occasionally, and I'll look at it, and you think, gosh, you know, that was born in 1958 in Kalamazoo. And you know, there's something quite special about that, and I think in many ways it's similar to a painting or a great piece of furniture. It's just a lovely thing to own.
Yeah, and I think it for me, it has the added, a lot of everything that you've said resonates. Everything, even the people you talk about, are people who are all within living memory. So this is very much a 20th century phenomenon in its way, isn't it? It's something that we at various ages in our life have come into contact with. I think it's fabulous. I don't know. I think there is history in each one, and I can see that you could go and look at a guitar that you own and perhaps not relive the past, but at least be connected with it in a way which is very tangible. It's fascinating.
I think the thing with owning stuff like that, it's, as you say, it's a connection to the past. You've got something and you think, wow, that's you know, it's just interesting. And I think the fact that you can do something with it as well, you can kick out a tune, or kind of just, even if you just, you know, pick up a guitar every once in a while and play, you know, You Really Got Me by the Kinks or something like that, and just, you know, 3 chords and think you can play the thing. It's great, and that's all it needs to be. And I think if you get some enjoyment out of it, it's exactly the same as looking at a picture, in my mind. But obviously you might disagree. But yeah, no, I think that we haven't even touched on other instruments, to be totally honest. But I think guitars, and electric guitars specifically, are the thing that you know, capture, I think, the imagination of most people around the world when it comes to instruments.
No, I agree. You've certainly enthused me. I'm sure I shall leave this now and go and do some rootling around myself and seeing what I can see and learn from this. And I think a lot of our watchers and clients will be thinking the same. I don't know about you. I've really enjoyed this. Was there anything else that you wanted to tell us?
No, I think we pretty much touched on it all. I suppose the only other thing is that with electric guitars, that there is obviously something that they need to go through. And the other point is that the vast majority, in fact, pretty much all of the things that we've been talking about today have been American. They were at the forefront of guitar manufacture. They did pretty much everything. There was Burns in London in the 1960s who made some really good guitars, but not on the same level as Fender and other things like that. But the funny thing is, amplification, when you look at amps, you look at any stage in the entire world, and I guarantee you, if you go to a festival, there'll be at least one band that has this on the side of their stage, which is a big wall of Marshall stacks, which is synonymous now, I suppose, with the rock world. And Jim Marshall, who made Bletchley near Milton Keynes famous for making for manufacturing guitar amps, so every hard rock band in the world at some point has played Marshall amplifiers, and that's a really, really nice thing. And they're still made there now, still made by the same company, and still made to the specification that people want. Strange kind of point here, Pete Townsend from The Who in the early 60s couldn't get enough volume out of his amplifiers, so this was why he actually went to Jim Marshall from Marshall and said, I need you to make me some bigger speaker cabinets. And that is where the 4x12, which has got 4 12-inch speakers in each of them, came about. So that's a really good thing. But just as my last point, sorry, I could talk about all day.
No, this is fascinating. Do carry on.
The other manufacturers was a little firm out of Dartford called Jennings Musical Industries. And now Jennings, they made the other most important, possibly, piece of musical equipment of the 1960s, and that was the Vox AC30. Now, the Vox AC30, they did a Vox AC15, which is a 15 watt. This is a 30, so it's a 30 watt with 2 12-inch speakers in it. This was maybe the sound of the Beatles. It was the sound of the Rolling Stones. In the early part, it was the sound of the Who. It was the sound of the Small Faces. In the 1970s, it was the sound of the Jam. In the 1990s, it was the sound of Blur. It was the sound of Oasis. It's pretty much the quintessential British amplifier, and I've got one. And to be honest, I think that is as much of an important item as any of the guitars are, because effectively the sound's got to come out of somewhere, and if it's not coming out of somewhere worthwhile, I think somebody actually once said, I think it was Joe Bonamassa, who said, you're better off, if you're starting to learn the guitar, getting a decent amp and a reasonable guitar than a great guitar and a reasonable amp, because the amplifier is just as, if not more important than any other part. But they don't, it's a little bit boxy compared to a Fender Jazzmaster though.
It looks a very elegant piece of machinery to me. It looks a little bit like a Louis Vuitton case somehow. It looks very elegant.
I'm sure they would love you to say that. Yes, it's no, it's brilliant. Unfortunately, it's incredibly fragile, and I've been on tours where these have been dropped down flights of stairs, and all the glass valves have been smashed.
Yeah.
And it'll cost you 300 quid just to replace the valves. They're not the most reliable things in the world, but when they're right, they're spot on.
Yes, I was going to say probably to get it to work is, or at least to know it's working is a bit of a feat in itself. But they look very elegant pieces of machinery.
They're great, but again, something. So the Marshall and the Vox, pretty much items that were designed in the 50s and 60s and haven't really changed a great deal up until now. So Yeah, a good point. I think the way to describe it is they all got it right first time, and that's why they're all exactly the same now.
Oh, that's remarkable, isn't it? It's a success story of success in many ways, isn't it? Just building on the initial successes and the designs. I think are the most striking thing. That's my takeaway is how beautiful some of them are, and how not just elegant but innovative, just coming out of nowhere, and there they are, and becoming part of our almost day-to-day lives if we're musicians, certainly, or keen on music.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. My head is full of so much good information you've given us, and I think hopefully everyone will have enjoyed it as much as I have. So thank you, Alastair. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. I think I've learned something and had a very enjoyable time.
My pleasure, as always, Jonathan. It's nice to be able to impart some knowledge on you as opposed to you on me, which is normally the case.
Well, there you go. It's mutual for sure.
Great. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. And we will see you next week, hopefully.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for listening.